Today we equally will look at the respiratory system. And the same as the renal system is also not much extensive in terms of physiology. We'll simply see right now that you are seated, you are able to breathe in and breathe out. And that will be entirely in this class. We'll only be interested to see the mechanisms that allows you to breathe in and breathe out, and what exactly happened right now. And we might also be see the variation that what will happen perhaps maybe when you subject you to different condition, what will happen to your respiration rate. And the system doesn't work alone. It works very closely with the cardiovascular system. They have a shared function because they are independent, or rather interdependent. Your oxygen will be required in different section of the body, and courtesy of the cardiovascular system, that will be made possible. And the respiratory system doesn't work alone, so much independent on its own. It requires to be regulated by another higher function, which is the nervous system. But in this case, we'll not go into the nervous system. We'll only focus our attention similarly to breathing in and breathing out and see what exactly happened. Other functions will come later when we put the picture of the nervous system and the cardiovascular system together. So then these are the function of the respiratory system. It's simply the process of gaseous exchange. And or sometime in other materials, you can see them being referred to as the external respiration. That is the movement of gases in and out, to distinguish it from the internal respiration as we see later. So the gaseous exchange actually takes place in the functional unit of the lung, which is the alveoli. It's an equivalent of the nephron in the kidney, or an equivalent of the neuron in the CNS. And these gases will have to pass through several places before they finally reach the area where respiration takes place. And quite a few things will have to be modified, and the passage to the lungs will have to be purified a little bit. Right now, the room temperature in most places, is, for example, where I am, is slightly around 20 degrees to 18. That temperature, the air is too cold to be taken in, and it will probably cause an irritation. So it needs to be warm a little bit to come closer to room temperature, or even close to the body temperature. It contains a lot of particle. It needs to be purified. And in some instances, the air is so dry and it needs to be humidified by adding a little bit of moisture to it, so that the ultimate aim of gaseous exchange can be achieved. And as I said, it's a shared responsibility with the CVA system. This is the passage of air. So from the external later into the larynx, where we have the oral, pharynx, and later we have a subdivision. The other section will go into the esophagus. We'll not be interested for that for now. And it will go into the trachea, later into the bronchi, which will be divided into the right and the left one, and later into the primary, secondary, and tertiary bronchus, and later into the alveoli. And this also is a sagittal section, still of the same, where we have several structures here within the larynx and the pharynx, all the way into the level of the trachea. So individually, we have the receptors, the olfactory receptors. So they're usually located at the mucosal, just a few centimeters into your external nares. And the purpose of that one is to detect smells as part of the special senses. Right now, we'll skip that one. And the rest of the mucosa is like the respiratory mucosa, which is made up of cuboidal cells. It contains the mucous membrane, and it is ciliated. So the cilia, swapping movement of the cilia is to move substances in a very specific direction. The mucosa, the cuboidal mucosal cells secrete the mucus, and that one will ensure that will moisten the air and trap any foreign particles. We have some cavities that surround, if you still remember your anatomy of the head and neck, specifically the cranial bone, and the paired bone, which usually the sphenoid and the maxilla, the ethmoid and the frontal bone, all of them contain some empty spaces inside that we call them the sinuses. So specifically the paranasal sinuses, and the cavities ensure that the head become a little bit lighter, but sometimes it has a downside in that when the sinuses that drain then become blocked, you end up with a condition called sinusitis, which presents as a sharp headache that usually doesn't resolve by taking the usual analgesics or painkillers. The other purpose beside making your skull a little bit lighter is to access a resonance chamber to ensure you have your voice the way you are right now. And you appreciate that one, but when you get a common cold that is, and you hear your voice become a little bit different, that is because the sinuses or the paranasal sinuses become clogged with air, and that one changes the resonance, and your speech will ultimately changes. They usually produce a mucus which drain into the nasal cavity in what you call the conchae, which are the three of them, the superior, medial, and the inferior. So the pharynx or the throat, it is made up of these three regions. You have the nasopharynx, which is a superior region, just behind the nasal cavity. We also have the oropharynx, so that is the middle region and just behind your mouth. And then we have the laryngopharyngeal region, which is the inferior region, and it's in continuous attachments with the larynx. So the oral and laryngopharynx are common passage for both the air and the food. And the process of swallowing, as we see later when you cover the digestive system, is we have the mechanisms that ensure that one section is closed while you are swallowing to ensure that the food doesn't go into the respiratory system, or what we simply refer as choking in case it happens. So the pharynx, on both lateral sides, we have the auditory tube, or simply the Eustachian's tube, which connect the internal ear and the pharynx. And the purpose is to ensure we have a balanced air pressure within the internal part of the ear and the pharynx. So it's simply like a valve that regulates the pressure. So we have the tonsils, and the tonsils purpose is they are protective. So we have the adenoid tonsils, or sometimes called the pharyngeal tonsils, which are located in the nasopharynx. And then we have the palatine tonsils, which are slightly just after your tongue, and we refer that one to as the oropharynx. We also have the lingual one at the base of the tongue. And the purpose of all these, they take part in the immune system as a protective, together with the lymph node, and much of it will be covered in your immunology class. We move down all the way into the larynx, sometimes called the voice box. So this is the route where air and the food into the proper channel. So it plays a role in voice production. We have some thin ligaments which loosen and tightens, and when the hair hits them from your lungs, it produces a vibration. And courtesy of that, you are able to hear me as I speak right now. So it's made up of 8 rigid cartilages, specifically the hyaline cartilage, and there are 4 on each side, and there are spoon-shaped flap of elastic cartilage, sometimes called the epiglottis. Let's move downward into the trachea. So the trachea is anterior to the esophagus. It's still lined with a ciliated mucosa, and the cilia beat in a continuously motion in an opposite direction from the incoming air. In that, they beat from down upward. And while you inhale air that might contain some particle, the mucus will trap them, and the cilia will move them all the way into the oropharynx. And once it reaches there, it causes an irritation. And the irritation will produce produce a coughing reflex. And that coughing reflex will make you to cough and you either swallow it or you spit it out. And so just to make a distinction here, that an irritation in the trachea will cause you to cough. And an irritation in the upper airways, so that's the nasopharynx, will make you to sneeze. So not two distinction because they are regulated by two different sections of the brain, the section depending on where. So for example, you inhale something that you might be possibly be allergic to, like dust, to make you to sneeze. And if your mouth was open, then that you breathe through your mouth, it will cause you to have a coughing reflex. So you can note down those two distinctions. Also, the walls are made up of a C-shaped hyaline cartilage, which are on the anterior section. And you can just appreciate by palpating your trachea anteriorly. So we have those two C-shaped hyaline cartilages that run all the way along the entire anterior length of the trachea. In between the cartilages, we have some smooth muscles that lines in between. So we have the primary bronchi. So immediately out of the trachea, we encounter the primary bronchi, and it's a division of the trachea, and they supply both of the lungs. So it enters the lungs through the hilus. So that is the depression at the section, the medial sections of the lung. So the right bronchus is wider, shorter, and straight than the left. And because of that, for example, when someone swallows a foreign, for instance, when a child swallows a coin, almost all the time it will go into the right bronchus, and because of all this anatomical distinction between the right and the left, it will further subdivide into smaller and smaller branches, and we call that one the bronchial tree. So finally we'll end up at the lungs, and it occupies most of the thoracic region. And you remember in your anatomy, while subdividing all the region within the thoracic cavity, we have the anterior, posterior, and the distinction, all the landmark, including where the heart occupies. So we call that one the mediastinum region, and the landmark are all taken through by the anatomy. Of significant importance, of the lungs, the apex is the region that is superior, closer to the clavicle, into lobes by fascias. So the left lung is made up of 2 lobes, and the right lung is made up of 3 lobes. They are covered by pleura. So we have the visceral lining the lung surfaces, and the pleura covering the thoracic wall. And in between, we have the pleural space, and it's usually filled by a fluid called the pleural fluid, and minimizes or reduces friction. So further subdivision of the respiratory tree, we have the primary, secondary, tertiary bronchi, which will subdivide into the bronchial and the terminal bronchial. So diagrammatically, you can see a representation of still of the same, that will move the bronchioles subdivide until you finally reach the respiratory zone, which are the bronchioles, which at the tip of it, we have the air sacs or the alveoli, which is the functional unit. The respiratory zone, so we subdivide it physiologically. We can still subdivide it into the conduction zone and the respiration zone. All the structures that we have been talking up to now, from the external nares or the nostrils until we reach the terminal bronchioles, we call that region the conduction zone. And then we have the respiration zone. These are the section where the gaseous exchange actually takes place. And it includes the respiratory bronchioli, the alveoli duct, and the actual alveoli. These are the site of gaseous exchange. So the structure of the alveoli, so it's made up of a duct and sacs and the alveolus, and this is where the gaseous exchange takes place. And of course, it's microscopic in that you can only be able to appreciate it under a microscope. So the respiratory membrane, so this is the barrier between the air and the blood. So it's usually 1 cell thick. and it lines the alveolar wall and is made up of the squamous epithelial cells. So the pulmonary capillaries cover the external surfaces of the alveoli. So you imagine like you have a ball, and the ball, if you remember while you are still probably young for the boys, sorry for the men in this class, you have to have that ball, and which has several names according to where you came from. That ball used to be made up of polythene, and you use a thread to sew around it, all the circular. And alveoli, if you ever seen that ball, it looks almost exactly like that. That you imagine the external polythene will be the squamous epithelial, and the thread that you use to make up or secure the polythene will be the capillaries that covers it, and it looks that way exactly if you ever seen that ball. Still, here we have a diagram of the respiratory membrane, and you can be able to appreciate it that we have the alveoli, and in between these epithelial cells and some cells which we call them the type 1 pneumocytes. These are the squamous epithelial cells. And we also have some other cells, we call them the surfactant cells. So surfactants, we call them the type 2 pneumocytes. And the purpose is to secrete some fluid, which is a little bit thick, and we call that fluid the surfactant. And the purpose is to line all the internal part of the alveoli, and it will increase the surface tension and ensure, rather reduce the surface tension and ensure that the alveoli doesn't collapse on its own, because it's simply a vacuum inside. So those are the regions, and you can just appreciate we have some RBC. So we have a magnification of it here. We can appreciate we have this is the RBC. So this is it towards the capillary section, and this was toward the alveolus, and this is the epithelial cells, which we call them the type 1 pneumocyte. And it's so thin, made up of one cell, so the gases are able to diffuse in between, where the CO2 will go into the RBCs, and the O2 goes into the RBCs, and the CO2 will diffuse in an opposite direction. And exactly that is what we call the gaseous exchange. So the exchange occurs at the respiratory membrane. As I said, the O2 will move into the blood and CO2 will move in the opposite direction. And the movement is determined by the partial concentration of the gases. In that, the air you inhale, which is made up of about the concentration of O2 in the atmosphere at the sea level, is about 21. And your lungs, from the blood, specifically the venous blood, so the partial concentration is low, which is about 14. And because of that differences, it moves from the air in the alveoli into the blood. And because we have the process of internal respiration, and the byproduct of it is CO2, the partial concentration is higher on your venous blood compare to the one in the atmosphere, and it should be able to move down its concentration gradient. So I also mentioned that we have the macrophages within the lungs, and they have a protective function against the foreign bodies. And we also have the surfactant, as I said, to reduce the surface tension. So the events of respiration, we have the pulmonary ventilation, which is some just moving the air in and out of the lungs. And we have the external respiration, which is the exchange of gases between the pulmonary and the blood. So respiratory gas are transported, as I said, via the bloodstream. And at the tissue level, we have the exchange between the blood and the tissue and the systemic capillary. This is a diagram still I've been looking for. Still what I say, that because of the partial concentration in between the blood and the alveoli, the two gases move in an opposite direction. We have been talking about the process of ventilation as simply a mechanical process that allows you to take in air and later expel it. And it's a completely mechanical process, and it relies on the physical properties of gases, where a change in pressure a change in volume in an enclosed space will cause a change in pressure. And later, due to the dynamic of the fluid, the air will be able to move down the pressure gradient. So it's dependent on the changes in the thoracic cavity, and the volume changes will lead into the changes in pressure. It occurs in two. We have the process of inspiration, where right now you are breathing in and later you breathe out after a few seconds. So during inspiration, so the diaphragm, which is made up of the skeletal muscles lining, separating your abdomen from your thorax, together with the intercostal muscles, which we have the internal and the external intercostal muscles between your ribs. So the size of the thoracic cavity increases because the diaphragm resumes a flattened shape. And because of the increase in the thoracic cavity volume, so the pressure will reduce, it go below the 272 atmospheric pressure, and the air will be able to flow in. So diagrammatically, this is what happened, that the dimension of the thoracic cavity will increase both vertically and laterally because of the contraction of the external intercostal muscles, and the contraction of the diaphragm will give you that classic shape, and the volume later will increase and the pressure reduces and air flows in. So let's see what happen in the opposite direction. So exhalation is largely an passive process because once the muscles have contracted, we expect them to relax later spontaneously, and the relaxation will cause a reverse of the initial air moves out of the lungs. But sometimes, for example, when you are coughing, you are able to use what you call the accessory muscles of respiration. That is for example, the sternocleidomastoid and the rectus muscles of the abdomen. That when they contract, you are able to force an expiration. You are able to expel more air than what you inhale initially. So those are the muscles involved in the process of expiration. In terms of the volumes, right now for an average adult, you breathe in about a liter of air in and out. So you breathe in 500 and you breathe out 500. So we call that one the tidal volume. And it's dependent, it's an average of 50, 500 ml per liter, but it's dependent on the person's size. For example, someone who has maybe a larger body size will have a slightly higher volume. It's high in male compared to female, and also the physical status at that time. And of course, as age increases, it increases, but during later senescence or old age, it tends to reduces. So we have the residual volume of air that after breathing out the 500 ml, you are still able to remain with about 1.2 liters, and we call that one the residual volume, or sometimes the expiratory reserve volume. So your rate of breathing right now possibly is around maybe 14 if you are just seated quietly in your bed, having your phone, maybe still sleeping. And maybe if you're moving around, it might slightly increase to 18. And so it's dependent among these factors. So the temperature, the body temperature is dependent on the respiration rate. And for example, you have malaria and your body temperature is approaching 38. So the body will attempt to lose the excess heat. And one way of losing the excess heat is through the respiratory system, and that one increases it. Also, in order to increase the movement or the circulation of blood into your skin, so you require to have more air in your blood, and that will increase the respiratory rate. So exercise while you're exercising, the one increases, and that will increase your rate. While working, because of that interruption, so you will have to increase your rate slightly. Because I'm talking right now, and I assume that you're muted and you're not talking, we have a difference of the respiratory rate, maybe of 1 or 2. And also when you cough, the interruption will also causes that one. So those are the physical factors. And then we have the evolution, so the conscious factors, that you can decide to hyperventilate and increase your respiratory rate to a certain extent. There's a rate you can't go beyond. For example, you cannot maybe do beyond 30 because your brain will remind you not to do that one. And your emotional status also. For example, maybe you receive some sad news that your boyfriend or girlfriend tells you that we are done, and so probably I expect your um, respiratory centers to be activated, become a bit emotional, and perhaps you either start crying or you might faint. But either way, it will cause your respiratory rate to increase. Or for example, you are told that you maybe you have a supplementary at the end of the year, and maybe you ended up accumulating for supplementaries, so that will make you a little bit sad, and your respiratory rate will increase. But also, if the supplementary will be in the part of the physiology, so that one might help you understand the respiratory system further. We have the chemical factors equally. So this is the CO2 levels, that when the CO2 levels in blood increases, we have the chemoreceptors as we see later. So they are simply the signal that detect the changes, and that one will activate the respiratory centers. Also, the CO2 levels in the atmosphere or the oxygen level will also be determined by that. So O2 level and CO2 level, as I mentioned initially. We are almost coming into the end. We'll see some development aspect. In your midwifery class, you see immediately when the child is born. So you always, people at the maternity or the labor ward become happy when a child is born and they cry immediately. So that cry usually signify that the baby has taken the first breath and expel the fluid that is usually accumulate within the lungs while the fetus is still in the uterus. So when the baby is still in uterus, the lungs is filled up with fluid, and immediately upon birth, so when that one cause some irritation and activate the respiratory centers of the baby brain, and that will cause the child to cough or rather sneeze and expel the fluid, and they cry on the processes, and we ensure. And that one will give us a satisfaction that the lungs are functioning well. So if the baby doesn't cry, it means the fluid is still accumulated within the lungs, and usually give a few 5 minutes. If the baby still doesn't cry, you have to do some physical stimulation, and later that will be the process of resuscitation. But the aim of resuscitation is to try to jumpstart the process of respiration to ensure the child expel the fluid within the lungs. If they fail to do so, we have other mechanisms of doing that one physically, of draining the fluid. I talk about the surfactants. So the surfactants are the type 2 pneumocytes which secrete that fluid, and it lowers the alveolar surface tension inside, so to ensure it doesn't collapse. And it usually develops from a certain around 7 months, and it's fully become developed when the child reaches the term, which is 38 weeks. Any child born before 38 weeks, we call them the preterm, and they're usually not, most of the time, not able to breathe on their own, and they might require some, maybe to be put on oxygen, because their lungs have a tendency to collapse because they don't have the sufficient surfactant. And there is a drug which is a corticosteroid, which can stimulate the surfactant cells to be produced. When there is a reason to know that the mother might going to deliver a preterm baby, so they are put into this dose of corticosteroid for 3 days, and that one may fasten the process of surfactant production within the uterus. You will talk later, maybe this is beyond the scope of this class, but later, I don't know if you have begun it yet, but you'll talk about the process of maybe midwifery, the normal labor, and we know the delivery usually happens at around 40 weeks or 9 months. There's a correlation that the baby decides on when to be born, and the decision is a communication um, between the lungs of the baby and the brain of the mother. That when we have sufficient surfactant in the lungs, so it will induce a signal into the brain of the mother to start producing oxytocin from the posterior pituitary gland, and the receptors later in the uterus will increase, and it will initiate the normal development of labor. But of course, it's not highly tested, but it's the most plausible explanation we have. Let's see what happens as aging take effects. So the lungs elasticity decreases, so the vital capacity decreases, blood levels also decreases, and the stimulating effect of the CO2 from the brain decreases, and that one will predisposes the age into the respiratory tract infection and an ability or a predisposing to easily die. When a baby is still perhaps maybe some immediately after minutes where they are born, so the rate is usually very high, 40 to 80. Maybe after a week when the infancy begins, so the respiration reduces slightly to about an average of 30. And later between the age of 5 to the respiration is 25. You and I right now, we are working at an average of 18. And as you get older, it reduces and reduces. So that one brings us into the end of this first session in respiratory system. We'll have another session next week to see some other aspect of regulation of the respiratory system.